everyone. I hope that you won't find this afternoon completely disconnected from this morning. In fact, I think the connections are pretty clear and pretty distinctive. I think some of the questions we need to be facing are the same questions. So I'll work through a little bit of background. I have to say, here's another example of kinship. So does the name Peter Carroll mean anything to many of you? Okay. So Peter was asked by the Bishop of Christchurch to do a presentation yesterday on the Motion 29 report. And Peter heard, as the networks tend to hear, that we were having a meeting here today, and that one of the things we'll be focusing on is getting an understanding of what the report suggests is clear. And he also heard that Belinda was really unwell. And so he texted me last night and said, "Look, I've got this PowerPoint presentation that I've just used at our synod. Would it be any help to you?" So, thank you, Peter. And look, I'm going to give my own spin on this a little bit. I think I sit reasonably uniquely to this process, but let me try and provide a bit of context. 1978, so 3 years before I was ordained a priest, the first report on human sexuality was produced by our church. So for my entire ordained ministry, which is now 1981 to 2017, this has been front and centre in the life of the church. Enough already. You'll remember that we had two major groups working in the period between 2012 and 2014. There was the Commission on Doctrine and Theological Questions, who explored the theology around the doctrine of marriage, the biblical material in relation to same-sex attraction and behaviour. And you remember that report said really clearly to General Synod in 2014 in Waitangi, there are two irreconcilable views that are scripturally and theologically based, that have currency in this church, that are held to in terms of deep conviction, and they are irreconcilable. If you hold one view, you can't believe that the other view has any truth to it at all. That was the position. And they put the two arguments, and those who held to one argument said the other argument doesn't stack up, and those who held to the other argument said this argument is inconsistent. So that was 2014. There was another group that we established in 2012, and that was the Marthea Commission. And the Marthea Commission, as you remember, was headed by former Governor-General Sir Anand Satanyand, and it was an eminent persons group, really, some of Aotearoa New Zealand's most significant leaders, both in Māoridom and in the nation generally. And they simply travelled around the church listening to the diversity of view. And remember that, we have been having what we've variously called respectful conversations and study groups, and we've been doing that since, when was that? 2003 in this diocese. Yep. And so Marthea gathered all of that information and said, you as a church, you are a long way away from coming to any kind of reconciled position on this. The biggest question you will have to face is, can you live with each other? Can you live with this level of difference of view and still believe that the other is a faithful disciple of Christ. This group of lay people, many of them non-Anglicans, said to the church, can you actually believe that Christ loves the person that you disagree with most? Interesting question. So we received the report of the Doctrine Commission and we received the report of the Fair Commission, and we had these two pieces of work before us. And those of us who were at General Synod 2014 in Waitangi had a profound experience of the movement of the Holy Spirit. It was palpable. It was deeply moving and it was deeply disturbing. And I vividly remember people who were diametrically opposed approaching each other in deep humility and saying, we have to find a way of staying together. And there'd been a working group working throughout the synod, and they worked amazingly hard, and they produced a resolution which was unanimously agreed to. And, you know, many people said yes with their other hand tied behind their back, you know, and the tied behind your back is you kind of view you hold. And saying yes was saying we have to find a way of staying in relationship, because actually I might really dislike Stephen and I might really dislike his views on things. I may think that he is wrong. What I cannot deny is that he's experienced the saving power of Jesus Christ. And he can't deny that in my life. And the point of our unity is not in anything that is between us, but in the Christ who stands between us and before us. And we heard the Spirit say that to us profoundly. So, motion 30 was passed, and it was an amazing kind of challenge, and the motion 30 working group was asked to go away and come back with proposals that would, as is summarised here, a way for our church to permit blessings of same-sex couples who enter civil marriages, a way for our church to include theologies of marriage and sexuality which do not support such blessings. But in 2016 we were deadlocked. And that deadlock took, again, a very profound form, and it affected me personally very deeply. Because Tikana Māori and Tikana Pacifica were at a point of saying, these proposals we can live with. Now, what you've got to kind of put your head into in relation to the Motion 30 proposals was that for Polynesia, this is in a situation where 2 out of the nation states in Polynesia still criminalise homosexuality. And yet they were saying, we believe that this is a way forward. It was called, the report you remember was called A Way Forward. We believe it is a way forward. And for those parts of our church who wish to move in this direction, we believe there are enough safeguards in there for us, in our context, that we can live with that. Māori said, we have strongly opposing opposite views. We have strong voices, just as the rest of the church. However, fundamentally, we gather around a deeply important principle for us, is that no one gets excluded. So, they were ready to vote going forward. Pākehā, this was my crew, I was chairing this, we were just unbelievably divided. And I witnessed behaviour and rhetoric that deeply ashamed me. Made me feel deeply ashamed. And I presided over that. And we just knew that we were going to break hugely. Nelson as a diocese couldn't support the Motion 30 propositions. A third of the Diocese of Christchurch was going to walk. Wellington was saying, we actually can live, we've discussed this, we can live with it, but we're not going to agree to it if it means Nelson goes and Christchurch is broken. And who knows where Waikato Taranaki would have voted. We were a pretty diverse table. What was clear was that for a very significant minority in our church, the Motion 30 propositions were untenable, in conscience untenable. And that was recognised. So I reported back from a Te Kana Pākehā caucus to the General Synod and said, Pacifica and Māori, this is who we are and where we are. This is our reality. We went back into caucus and Pākehā just sat looking at each other. Māori and Pacifica came together and considered the situation that Te Kana Pākehā was in, and then they came back into the room and they offered to allow the Motion 30 report and the motion that was going to implement it to lie on the table. So we went back into Te Kana Pākehā caucus and we behaved appallingly. It was kind of like, we've been saved from ourselves. And the finger pointing and the accusations were not very pretty at all. We forgot about the grace that had been shown to us. We forgot about the gift that had been given to us from Te Kana Māori and Pacifica. We just assumed that actually our needs were the most important needs. I've never been more embarrassed. And so we went back into Synod and basically didn't find the grace to say thank you, didn't find the humility to recognise what had been offered to us, and started setting conditions on what we needed to be able to work on things for the next couple of years. And Māori and Pacifica said, excuse us, we want to go back into caucus. They came back and said, enough. Let's put the motion, let's debate it. And we were shocked. So we went back into caucus. And in the Te Kana Māori and Te Kana Pacifica caucus, Brown Ture stood up, apparently, this is what was reported to the Synod about 10 minutes later, and said, I recognise what this is doing to my brother Philip. And he and I are, with Winston, the primacy. So what's happening to him is happening to me. And I cannot stand with you, Te Kana Māori and Te Kana Pacifica, if it means I can't stand with my brother Philip. And he was offering Māori and Pacifica a kind of word picture of the nature of the church. We cannot stand aside from our brothers and sisters who are broken. So I'm telling that story partly because I want to acknowledge our huge debt to Archbishop Brown for his wisdom and his leadership and his insight, but also just to recognise how fundamentally this is related to relationship, to kinship, to compassion, to mutuality. So we were humbled by that, finally, and we had the grace to say thank you and to commit ourselves as Te Kana Pākehā to, if we were given this 2 years back, which is what Māori and Pacifica decided to do in response to Brown's plea, we promised we would not squander it. Māori and Pacifica asked for it to go on record that in 2018 they will move on the original proposals. So, one of these wonderfully worded motions which left the primates the responsibility to appoint a small working group with a very tight timetable. And that working group was told explicitly by the Synod resolution that it was not to revisit the theological and biblical issues because we were already acknowledging that they were irreconcilable, but rather to try and identify structural mechanisms which would allow what was called in the motion both integrities to stay together within the same ecclesial family, the same church. And it was a very focused set of terms of reference, and the primates were invited to identify who should be on that working group and appoint them, and that they were to respond by the 1st of July 2017. That's a very tight timetable for that kind of work to be done. We appointed the Reverend Katene Eruera, who is the Dean of Māori students at St John's College. Mrs Jackie Pearce, who was the General Secretary of this church for a number of years, is a lawyer and is part of Te Kana Māori. They were the two Te Kana Māori appointees. Jeremy Johnson, who's the Chancellor of the Diocese of Christchurch, and a very able, very young, very able lawyer with a good understanding of church law. Leanne McGrath, who is the coordinator for the Affirm network in the Diocese of Auckland, and Faye Tevy, who's a diplomat and layman from Te Kana Pacifica. So a small group of 5. Bishop Richard Eleanor, that's right, 6. They said Jackie Pearce. Yeah. Bishop Richard Eleanor from Nelson. So it was heavily weighted towards those with a conservative theological and biblical view of this, because in essence that was the group, the significant minority in our church, who felt significantly disenfranchised by the proposals in Motion 30, of Motion 30 Working Group. I have to say I sat in on every meeting. My job was to pray them into every meeting and to pray for them during the meeting and to assist them with resources as they needed it. And I was extraordinarily impressed with the way they worked, the way they listened across difference, the grace that they brought to that. And they made a decision early on that they would not bring anything to General Synod which they didn't have a consensus over. And that became pretty strong and pretty focused. Jeremy is a gay man in a committed relationship and would seek to have that relationship blessed by the church. That's an important element that he brought to the table as well. And he did that with great humility, dignity and courage, I have to say. They all did. They all brought their perspectives, but they were determined to work for the church as a whole. Okay, so we have this interim report. They were asked to report by the 1st of July, and that should have been the end of their work, but they asked the primates if they could present it as an interim report and asked us whether we would be open to keeping them alive, basically, as a group, that they could receive feedback and maybe reconsider some of their propositions in the light of feedback. And the motivation of that was really simple. They said, we trust the collective wisdom of the church and the insights that others might bring to this. I can't stress strongly enough what I think has been a group who have worked out of a deeply grace-filled and humble starting point. Our proposal is that there will be some sort of frame for a synod discussion. My inclination is that it doesn't need to be around a resolution where we have to vote. I don't think that's helpful. What the working group are looking for is feedback. So we will try and frame a discussion where we can gather the feedback, even if it's irreconcilable feedback, and Standing Committee can take responsibility to form that into a submission from our diocese to the working group, which they need to have by the 17th of November. Te Kana Pākehā is going to meet together with representatives of each of the dioceses on the 10th or the 11th of November, so hence the 17th. That gives a week for Te Kana Pākehā as a whole, given that we were where the roadblock was last time, to put a Te Kana Pākehā submission if we want to do that as a tikanga. So 40:30 p.m. on 17th November. Final report will be produced by February, and then General Synod, which is going to be held in New Plymouth in May 2018, will receive that report and consider it. You've got to remember that the Motion 30 working group report and its propositions are lying on the table. They're live still. So Synod will have effectively two alternatives to consider. Okay, so that's enough by way of background. Some of this I've already touched on. So the mandate was not to consider the differing theological positions or to interpret Scripture on this point. Instead, the very specific task of considering what arrangements and safeguards could be put in place to hold us together within the same ecclesial family so that no one was forced to compromise sincerely held beliefs. It sought structural solutions which would hold our church together in that unity which Christ expressed and which he has gifted to us. The report says that the members of the working group were acutely aware that no matter what is proposed, there will be pastoral implications. So what they sought to do was to try and alleviate some of those implications by creating a toolbox of recommendations which they believe will provide the structural and canonical changes needed to safeguard all theological convictions. They tried to create places where each can stand without compromise to the beliefs they sincerely hold. So it's really important from the point of view of the working group to see this as a kind of smorgasbord of a combination of proposals. Some combinations will be effective and appropriate in, say, a Nelson context, and some will be effective and appropriate in, say, a Christchurch context. So a diocese where you've got a very clear theological unity around, and biblical unity around one integrity, if you like, and a diocese which is very divided. I have to say Christchurch discussed this yesterday, and their recommendation as a diocese as a whole is that this should be accepted. So that most divided diocese has come to that basic recommendation. Okay, so it's important to see it as a smorgasbord and a combination. And if some bits of it seem weird to you, as they might to me, think about whether in someone else's context what seems weird to you might actually be helpful. Okay, so key recommendations. No alterations to the formularies of this church. So what are formularies? Formularies are what's in here? Prayer book. Why is that significant? Because we're not a confessionalist church. We don't have the Westminster Confession. We're not a church with a magisterium. We're not the Roman Catholic Church, where there's core doctrine which is established over hundreds of years, that's held as a kind of magisterium around which, and the Pope has the kind of oversight of that doctrine, and doctrine only changes if the Pope allows it to change. And you have a whole bureaucracy who can, keep looking at and reworking that doctrine. We are a church, lex credendi, lex orandi, lex vivendi. What we believe is what we pray, and what we pray is how we act. So if you want to know what Anglicans believe on anything, look at our prayers. If you want to know what we believe on baptism, we describe this in our baptismal service. If you want to know what we believe about marriage, have a look at what we say in our prayer book. Marriage, Christian marriage, is between a man and a woman. Our formulary says. Now, what this working group is saying, as General Synod itself has resolved, is that there is, over the nature of marriage and the possibility of same-sex marriage, no agreement in this church. So no change to the formulary should happen unless there is agreement. That's a really important first principle that they've identified. Whether you agree with it or not, that's what they're saying, is that you shouldn't, given that the formulary is so critical to how our doctrine is defined, you shouldn't move, as the Motion 30 proposal did, to adapt or even change or insert a new formulary until there is agreement across the church. So if you don't have agreement across the church, don't start touching the formularies, because that's a step too far for those who can't in conscience agree. They're also saying, secondly, actually, why does this have to be a General Synod decision? Why isn't this a decision which is made at the level where the relationships are most viable and most important, which is at the fundamental unit of the Anglican Church, which is diocese? That's the second principle that they've identified. Thirdly, let's amend the declarations of adherence and submission to the authority of General Synod te Hinata Whānui. Why is that significant? Two reasons. One, we are the only province in the Anglican Communion that requires this. All other provinces require a declaration of adherence to the rules, if you like, so the constitution and canons of any given province, not to the decision-making body, General Synod. So, that's significant, secondly, because if General Synod agrees to devolve power to the diocese, and someone who thinks that General Synod has made a wrong decision has to assent to that decision of General Synod, then you've got a problem. Whereas if it's brought to the level of the diocese or Amarangi making its decision, you've brought the decision making closer to the local community. And so the principle is about trying to empower local communities to have control over the effect of these decisions. And specifically what this working group has suggested is that actually General Synod should devolve this responsibility to where they believe and have argued it belongs, which is to Amarangi and diocesan bishops, to be able to authorise individual clergy in their ministry unit, with the agreement of that ministry unit, to undertake same-gender blessings. So it's very specific to a local context. That's a key element of what they're proposing here. Now, they're also saying that the form of blessing, and remember that goes back to the issue of changing the formulary, is something that under another provision already existing in our canons, a local bishop can authorise a form of service for use in a particular setting. That's already there, that provision. Now, the bishops have said, in a preliminary meeting we've had, is that if that's the case, then we would, and if all this was to go through, one of the first things that we would do by way of safeguard is to ensure consistency. So we would agree to a common form that each of us would authorise in those dioceses where we chose to actually pick this option up. And there'll be dioceses that don't, and dioceses that do. But it will be a common form, and the point of that is that old argument, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. One of the issues that many had with the recommendation and the draft services attached to the Motion 30 report was that it looked too much like the marriage service. Now, the reason that the Motion 30 group did that was because they wanted to be absolutely clear that it wasn't marriage. And so it was very prescriptive. But I don't think the subtlety of that was seen or welcomed by many, or understood by many, perhaps, as better. Okay. So you're getting a sense of the elements. Though one of the recommendations is that there should be immunity from complaint for bishops and clergy for exercising this discretion on whether or not to authorise conduct or conduct services of same-gender blessings. So, Bishop Richard of Nelson and the Diocese of Nelson decide that they cannot allow blessing of same-gender marriages in the Diocese of Nelson. No one across this province could bring a complaint against them. Similarly, the Diocese of Auckland bishops agreed and made that provision in, let's just pick one parish randomly, St Matthew's in the city, and authorised that there. Neither the vicar of St Matthew's in the city nor the bishops of Auckland can have a complaint brought against them. So an immunity clause. So not changing the basis of our disciplinary canons and our standards of professional behaviour, but ensuring that that cannot be the basis where a bishop acts in good conscience and properly cannot be the basis of a complaint. And then the bit which is receiving the most kind of kickback around the church, or question anyways, around orders of consecrated life. And this is a provision. The working group talked a lot about this, and they did a huge amount of research overseas, particularly around the declarations issue. That's where Jeremy Johnson put in days, weeks probably, of work around that, and actually travelled to a conference at his own cost in the UK on Anglican canon law, and was able to explore this directly with a number of provinces. But the idea of these orders of consecrated life is to provide a mechanism by which individual parishes and their clergy who hold to a particular perspective, it might not be on this issue, it might be around mission priorities, can form effectively a collective with their own rules of community life. And the implication for a diocesan bishop is that in that parish you can only appoint a priest who is either a member of that society or is sympathetic to the satisfaction of the local people, the principles of that society. So it's very like an order in the Roman Catholic Church. Best example from my own life, when Dave Monaghan, who was the chaplain at Francis Douglas Memorial College, died, and we were having the vigil mass in the college chapel the night before his requiem, which was going to be in the parish church. The Bishop of the Diocese of Palmerston North came for both masses, and I was to give the homily at the vigil mass in the parish, in the school chapel, which is a chapel that belongs to an order. The bishop said to me and to my family, "This is your home. You've been part of this community. We hope you would receive the sacrament." Now, Anglicans are not allowed to receive sacrament in Catholic churches. He said, "This church belongs to the order, doesn't belong to the diocese. The order have welcomed you. You're part of their community. You receive communion here, you and the family." And I did. In fact, the priest who was administering missed me out. I was sitting in a row with other clergy, and the bishop, top of his voice in front of 300 people in the college chapel, said, "Father, I think you missed the bishop out." The next day, he said to me, "I'm sorry, I can't extend the same hospitality to you. It grieves me that I can't. I don't like it." He said, "But if you would come forward, it would be a privilege to offer a blessing, and if you would bless me." And that's what happened in the parish church, because it has to live by the rules of the Vatican. Interesting. That's an example, really, where there is a discipline imposed upon the diocesan bishop where that diocesan view, or the diocesan bishop's view, is different from the local community. So that's the purpose of this, and it might seem a bit incomprehensible to some of us, but for some of those who submitted to the working group, this was seen as a really helpful mechanism. Okay? Just trying to give you the background. So there were some proposals and some submissions that suggested that this church should provide for a parish or a diocese to come under another province. And the working group decided that that was beyond its mandate, that it was asked to come up with mechanisms that held the church together, and that proposition was fundamentally about division. So it wasn't prepared as a working group to consider that. However, it did make these comments about other ecclesial arrangements. This issue of the human rights legislation has been one which has been around a very long time, and I began a conversation with the Attorney General on this at the time. It was just a few months after I became Archbishop, and you remember the Bishop of Auckland was taken to the Human Rights Tribunal by a young gay man who the Bishop of Auckland had not allowed to enter the discernment process for ordination. And I was the witness for the church, and I provided a 42-page submission on the current theological, biblical and canonical position of the church. And the Human Rights Tribunal upheld that and indicated that the state had no place in shaping the doctrine of the church. Whatever the state might think about our doctrine, the state had no place in shaping it. The legislation, particularly in the Marriage Amendment Act, is pretty explicit. What, in essence, it says is that if, as a denomination, say the Methodists, have agreed to change the doctrine of marriage and to provide for marriage of same-gendered couples, marriage, then if a minister in that denomination refuses to take such a marriage, they could be brought before the Human Rights Tribunal. The Attorney General's view, and the view of his staff, is that even in that situation it's highly unlikely to succeed for a variety of reasons. So that's at that end of the spectrum. What the Motion 30 proposition did was to say doctrine of marriage is not changing. A blessing of same-gendered state marriages would be provided for as a form of marriage. And the advice from the Attorney General is very clear that the Church has not changed its doctrine on marriage. The state might not agree with our definition of marriage, but that's not their business. And a blessing is nothing to do with the state. It's everything to do with the Church. And the Church can choose to bless who and what it wants to, without any intervention from the state at all. So a priest, a minister of this church, could not be brought before the Human Rights Tribunal. Well, they could be brought. Anyone can bring a complaint, and the Human Rights Commission have to decide whether to pursue it. They could decide to pursue it, but is it likely to be successful? And the Attorney General's office could find no basis in New Zealand law on which it would be successful. Now, this is exactly the same situation with what's recommended now, except that the service that would be used is not a formulary. It's not, therefore, representing an addition to doctrine, if you like, which is what has concerned many people about the Motion 30 proposal. Okay? So I think the Attorney General's advice is still very strong, and we've taken independent legal advice, and that supports that view. Nothing prevents an individual taking, as they did against the Bishop of Auckland, a complaint. In that case, the tribunal decided, or the commission decided to take it to tribunal, and I have to say the decision of that tribunal was all around the separation of the powers of church and state. And it's really clear, and it's fundamental to democracy. And that's why we fought it so hard. Not because we had an agreed view on, if you like, the principles or the substantive issues, but because actually this was the state raising the question about whether it would intervene in the fundamentals of religious freedom. And so one of our lawyers was actually one of the world's most well-regarded human rights lawyers. And he has a very strong view of marriage equality, but came in very strongly behind us because this fundamental principle of the separation of powers of church and state, freedom, religious freedom of expression is so fundamental to international law. Okay? Short answer, no. You will not be permitted, no Anglican priest will be permitted to conduct a civil marriage between same-gender couples. But under this provision, if your bishop agreed that in your ministry unit the form of service yet to be determined could be used for a blessing, a priest could do that, but the couple would have to already be married under New Zealand law.
Would you have to do that in a church, or could that be...
The blessing?
Yes. Has that been decided upon yet?
No, and, I mean, but if you think about the shift that General Synod made in 2012, which was to say that Christian marriage no longer had to be conducted in a church building, but could be conducted in other suitable places, if you apply that principle to the blessing. But one of the arguments here for those who have been strongly supporting blessing is about the faith community gathering. So it's a bit like the discussions we've had over the years about baptism not being a little service in an afternoon in someone's home, but actually the faith community being there and engaged and supported.
But you could see that a logical question from a couple would be, can you come to our civil service? Can you come to our civil
and the answer to that is no.
Bless it?
The answer to that is no.
The answer to that is no.
That will be specifically excluded from the provisions on what's recommended here. General Synod may take a different view, but at the moment that's specifically excluded because what the working group is saying is that actually just blurs the edges too much. If we are talking about blessing, then do it the way the Germans do it over marriage, which is, you have to be civilly married at least 1 week prior to a church blessing. And there are some who are arguing that marriage between heterosexual couples, we should move to that model.
Yes. Well, don't we in fact do that in what a marriage celebrant does in the church or elsewhere, is facilitate a couple to marry each other.
Yep.
And in a blessing relationship, effectively we're doing the same. So it's just a matter of whether the person is licensed to, as a celebrant, to carry out that task of ministry. No,
under what's proposed, no Anglican priest will be able to, as an Anglican priest, be on the civil list. That's very, very clear, and it's because we are saying, as a General Synod, the definition of Christian marriage is not changing. That resolution is in place. Brendan.
I just wanted to make a point that this motion can be known that any couple that have had a same-sex marriage and then come to church, they actually have to be regular attenders or have to be members of that congregation, don't they? This is what the motion 29 implies.
It is indeed.
So we're not just going to have people walking off the street saying, I want a blessing.
No, that's exactly right. But it would be less than honest of me to not say that I know, in relation to baptism, that there are varieties of standards applied by different clergy across my diocese around the degree to which the family, think about the intention of our baptismal, both doctrine and our practice, there are a variety of practices, and I could well imagine that some clergy in some contexts would have a much more open door policy on that specific issue. But you're right, the working group is very explicit. This is a provision for those, and they're quite a significant, body within our church of committed gay and lesbian people who are in committed relationships, who are part of our congregations.
The only other question I sort of had based around it is parishes also have the option to say no, they won't.
Correct.
But if they say no and the clergy person says yes,
Yes.
Then the bishop cannot license that clergy person. That clergy person, it has to be what in these suggestions, these provisions, and I remember quite a discussion in the working group about this. It has to be priest and parish on the same page over this issue, and if that priest leaves that parish, that authorisation is removed. So it is all about and this is one of the fundamental things that they were trying to, one of the first principles they worked on was, how can we make this fundamentally about the relationship and give people the confidence that their perspective, their position will be respected. Whether you're at St Matthew's in the city or whether you're in a parish that holds to a conservative perspective, how can those two positions be protected? And so these are the mechanisms that
What about parishes that have got both those, that have got that diversity within the parish? I mean,
then the principle there is about the degree to which priest, minister and parish council, priest and vestry work those issues through to the point where they together go to the bishop and say. So you have to work it out locally.
I can see that at one level it seems like the stuff that we can't work out at this level, we're bringing down to this level.
Oh, exactly.
And the same inability, the same diversity, diverse opinion exists. It certainly exists in my parish council. Passionately held beliefs on both sides. And I think it's putting it back to us to sort it out when it can't be sorted out at this level.
And the rationale for that is that it can't be sorted out at that level because it hasn't been sorted out at this level.
Yeah.
And that if you don't sort it out at this level, one way, wherever you end up,
Yes.
and that actually you have to trust those relationships. And you have to trust that, maybe a priest in a local setting is passionately of the view that blessings of same-gender marriages should be allowed. But their people are not in that place. And what you've got to do is to trust the significance of that relationship to moderate, if you like, even hold back the view of the one in order to preserve the pastoral oversight and relationship of the other. But there'll also be, if that relationship is viable and if the leadership is genuinely respected, the potential there for the leader to lead people into space that they hadn't expected to go. But to do that openly and properly. You can't impose it from above as the fundamental thing. Sorry, Peter then.
At least engage people at this level. Some of them just walk away from it.
Yep, and so the local responsibility is there. That's a fundamental principle here. Yep. And to work on them together. And those guidelines would cover exactly the kind of pastoral issues that you're talking about. So you would have, if you like, granted step 2 would be the granting of a general provision by the bishop to William and parish of Reading to provide lease in the same gender civil marriages. Responsibility, pastoral responsibility, then remains on you as the blesser, the one who asks God's blessing, to work through the pastoral appropriateness of that when a couple comes to you. And we will need to provide some pastoral guidelines to assist with that. The same way as we, years ago provided pastoral guidelines around baptism of infants and requirements on parents or godparents and what a priest needs to look for in those contexts.
Part of my question is also with, in a small community, if it comes out that, for instance, if I did this once, it would be, oh, you can do it forever. And I believe, as you've already stated, that each marriage or relationship needs to be very individually come to a conclusion, whether you wish to bless it or not. So that would be part of my concern in a small community. We seem to have a very large gay community. That would be the message set out that everyone is individually considered, not a foregone conclusion.
I think this would be a great issue to bring to the Synod so that we could consider whether it should go as part of the standing committee submission to the working group, because I think it's an insight from experience that I haven't really talked about in any other context. I've been listening to these conversations since 1978. Get your insight. I think the guidelines will be important. I think the pastoral resources that we bring as a diocese, we need to talk these things through, we need to provide some training around that, we need to potentially role play, all that kind of thing. I can imagine it could be that response initially, particularly in the kind of context you're describing. But I think that's probably more about the way what will be seen as innovation gets normalised in the sense of getting the balances right. And if there aren't checks and balances in there, if you don't bring priestly integrity into that discernment, the whole thing becomes a nonsense.
Can I ask a question about the orders of consecrated life, or is that coming up later?
No, far away.
2001, I spent a year in the UK and discovered something which distressed me somewhat, the forward in faith parishes, but the priests were not welcome. So I'm wondering, assuming I can get the website, if I set up the CIA, the Community of Inclusive Anglicans, and then the parishes that I associate with of Hamilton Superfluvium decides that it wishes to affiliate itself with the CIA. What happens with the parish property, and what happens with the relationship between the community and its bishop protector and the diocese? Do they still have to go through the local diocesan bishop to seek approval for blessing whatever happens to want to be blessed at the time?
Yeah, so you're asking a range of questions there. There are different questions there. This is, I'm the Bishop Protector for the Third Order of Franciscans.
Thanks be to God.
I have no jurisdiction in the Diocese of Dunedin, Christchurch. I don't. And this is all about episcopal authority continuing to rest with the licensing bishop, but there are obligations that would be defined as a result of these provisions. So if the provisions were agreed to by General Synod, they would then put some shape and form around that, and that would put some discipline around the way the bishop can exercise, as there is around, a bishop cannot say to me, no, you cannot come in and relate to Third Order Franciscans in my diocese. There is a huge obligation on me to tell the bishop I'm going, to ask the bishop permission to preside in his or her diocese, all of that kind of stuff. So property, look, there are at least 16 different answers to that question, because each and every diocesan trust board, and this diocese there are 2, have different rules. And so the issue over property is not one that I can give any kind of straightforward answer to. It's going to have to be worked out in local context. But I can say that the expectation of these recommendations is that land ownership will remain, property ownership will remain exactly where it currently remains. And that the disciplines that will be placed as a result of the parish belonging to an order of consecrated life will be about the way they give expression to and practice mission. But the property will remain. It's pretty difficult to see how a New Zealand court would do anything other than say the trustees have a fiduciary responsibility to maintain the property in the name of that parish in that location under the oversight of that diocese, because that's the history and that's what they have to protect for the future. That's a sort of fundamental principle of law, trust law in New Zealand. So, but who knows? I mean, some of that will get tested, undoubtedly, but hopefully it will be tested around those kind of issues rather than separation.
My question follows on from Lance's question in that when decisions are made by vestries,
Yep.
is that on a case by case, or at what point can there be change within vestry's decision one way or another? And how does that work pastorally?
Yep, that's a good question. It would not be on a case-by-case basis. It would be fundamentally unfair to pastoral. So there has to be, a majority or consensus or whatever the thresholds are that we're going to set in place. I haven't thought my head into that space at all, and that's where synod will need to have a conversation about that. Not with synod. But once it's made, it could then only be unmade by agreement of the bishop, the vestry, and priest. So you might get a change in priest, and the priest may take a different view, although we've got some significant protections that would suggest that the view would be consistent. But you could imagine that a view might change over time.
Because there is
change in membership.
Yeah, and there's changes in parish life anyway, isn't there? So,
yes, but again, it would have to reach a threshold in the opposite direction, wouldn't it?
yeah.
Whatever that threshold is, whether it's majority, whether it's consensus, whether it's unanimous, whatever we decide on this diocese should be the threshold. The threshold would have to be reached before there could be a change. And
one of the charms of this diocese, and one of the reasons, not that anybody ever asked me, I've never had any desire to go anywhere else, compared with England with its forward faith and affirming Catholicism and the man before the monkey and the dustbin of society, is what's going to happen as we're sort of pastorally put it. If all the people of this view form a lager there, and all the people of this thing form a lager there, and you've got two clergy for the whole area who have the same opinion, I mean, I can see a disastrous market.
yeah, and look, you're absolutely right. And I mean, this is like a really challenging situation that the church is having to face. And the working group have offered some broad recommendations that seem to be gaining a reasonable degree of broad support with lots of specific questions, just like that. And for me, personally, it does come back actually to the relationship between bishop and people, and that I think is where there is the opportunity. Because those, you raise that question, it means you've got to deal with that question. And it's not being dealt with in a kind of theoretical way at the General Synod level, where you might end up with, a resolution or parts of a canon that try to address the issue, but then has to try and get interpreted in the local context. Actually, you've got to design it for the local context. And I can well imagine that we might end up with some broad brushstroke guidelines, but that bishop, local clergy and local communities need to interpret those guidelines in that local context to make it work. Because if it becomes unsustainable, it's just going to beat people up.
You could also end up with divisive tribalism.
Yep, that's the risk, but actually we are the diocese of the church. What we're saying is we need to trust that ecclesiology. It's served us well for 500 years. We need to fundamentally trust it again. Some places it won't work, some places it will. if you've got a bishop that is really determined on a particular way, then you could have a problem. And that's why part of what this process of consultation is doing is what are the things that can provide adequate protection for the situation where a bishop has a very strong determination to enforce a position. I don't think in the current climate we've got any bishop who would do that. But you've got to be thinking about what is.
Pastor, yeah. I have relations who are in this relationship, and there may be a time, not now, but in the time to come, there may be a time where I may be asked to give them this particular marital status or the blessings on the life. And it's a way of hearing the views of how we've got to come towards the rescue to be able to get the parents. And that's something that I never really looked at in Māori. I never saw that as a gateway. That to me is now for the gatekeeper on. And I'm not used to those sort of things, actually. I'll have to tell you this. I am a radical person when it comes down to offering the farm.
Sure.
And I just want to get a clearance on that, how far could I go without being detrimental to the issue or the church itself. I'd rather stay within the confines of the church political scene, but if this is going to help us to come through, I'm going to have to look at things in another way.
I mean, you raised some really important points, and in a sense it's behind the question that Elaine was asking as well. So, Tikana Māori, in their response, I mean, they're talking about Urunanganui as we speak, and that I know is an issue which is being brought, is that the question of relation of a vestry. So, does that relate to the pariha or the rohe? How does that relate to a marae? All of those questions are being raised. Now, I think that if we were to raise those questions from within the Diocese of Waikato and Taranaki as well, because we hold that kind of diversity in our life, don't we? Yes. Then that would be really helpful. And we're some very significant representatives from Tikana Māori on this working group, and they predicted these kinds of issues and problems, but also recognised that actually the fundamental problem or sticking points were for Tikana Pākehā. And that if we can provide mechanisms, just because these mechanisms are in place for Tikana Pākehā and the Tikana Pākehā diocesan structure, that doesn't impose that onto Tikana Māori or Pacifica. Question for us is, if we have within our life as a diocese priests who are operating out of Tikana Māori, but within our diocese, then what are the kind of provisions that we might bring within this diocese to enable that to happen on your marae? And that again comes down to the relationship with the local bishop. You and I have a conversation and identify what the issues are. At very least, then I would have to go back to the standing committee of the diocese, synod out of session, probably go back to the diocesan synod and say, hey, here's our issue. We have priests in our diocese who are operating out of a different tikana, but are priests of this diocese. How do we resolve that? Now, I think that, and it's not dissimilar to the challenge that you're putting up, workplace support type situations. We would have to face the realities of context and mission. But the point, I think, which this working group made very well, is you can't have those conversations at a general synod level, because they are very specific to on-the-ground context. So what are the broad authorisations that should be delegated or left with? Because actually, our structure is that what do you do when you delegate up? You can delegate up, I suppose you can, effectively, through the voluntary compact, which is what we are. The diocese, which is the fundamental unit of the Anglican Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia, delegates up certain authorities to the General Synod. And General Synod working group, Primate's working group on this matter is saying, actually, we don't think this is something that should at this stage in the life of the church be delegated up. It does rest most appropriately at the fundamental unit level. And this is a very, very good example. As is cooperating parishes. There are more than cooperating parishes in any other diocese in this diocese. As is kind of workplace support context when you're a chaplain. All of those things, let's work that out together is what they're suggesting. And I think that's probably where I'm just about running out of steam and voice, to be honest. I hope it's continuing to open up the discussions. We'll frame a time in Synod, probably between a lunch and an afternoon tea break when you're most tired. What I'm really meaning is we'll try and seize a decent block of time. We'll do a quick presentation, and then if you can come with some of these questions really well in form, then we can gather them together and take some responsible action in terms of making the submission back to the working group by the 17th of
Get some of my calm, polite friends to write it.
yeah. Look, in the Archbishop role, I mean, I've had some butte letters over since the beginning of July. People are passionate about this across the whole spectrum, and there aren't two integrities. There are at least a dozen, and but within two broad categories. The fundamental question for me remains: can I trust the relationship that Stephen has with Jesus? To the point that if I fundamentally disagree with him, I still want to remain in ecclesial relationship with him. I see him as a valid disciple of Christ. And I'm sorry to personalise it, and maybe I'm wrong, but for me that's where it keeps getting focused. Because I get these letters from people.
Oh, yes. Not me. Only about me.
You asked me. I get these letters from people, and I think, what kind of Neanderthal are you? Or I think, do you even know that there is a New Testament? And then I go and because part of my role is I go and actually meet the person, and I can't see them in that light. And I can't see their concerns in that light, because it's about the relationship, and face to face changes them. And I don't want to get into a situation where I'm excluding people from my views simply because I disagree with them. As I say, as soon as I've actually gone face to face with people what they put to me in writing just looks like I just don't get that.
The same down.
No, it's not. I'd like to think so. But it's not actually about that. It's just about the way my perspective has changed by getting face to face with that person.
It's what was in the DVD, like between the rival gangs.
Oh, yeah.
The working
Oh,
relationship.
yeah.
You cannot.
He's not my enemy, he's my friend.
Because you cannot be side by side.
Yep.
And
What a lovely way to finish. A nice link back to this point. Okay. Are we all right?
Can we go home?
Okay. Well, we might pray first. Thank you for your generous engagement with today, and thank you for the time that you've given. I really appreciate the distances in this diocese. I know how far some of you have travelled and the effort that you've gone to be here. I don't take it for granted, and I feel incredibly supported by this diocese. I feel often too far away from you physically, but always held in prayer, and I'm grateful for that. So thank you. And thank you particularly for the prayers for Belinda. I just got a text to say that she's been sitting up in the family room in front of the fire
Good.
most of the day.
Sipping ginger ale.
So I'm grateful to God for that and for your prayers. And prayers for each of you. Many of you facing particular personal challenges and challenges in your ministry contexts. Just know that you are held in this fellowship and held in my heart and my prayers. In the face of your love, in the face of your sacrifice, in the face of your gracious gifting of yourself to us in your Son, Jesus Christ. We have no response other than to say thank you. And in that spirit of thanksgiving to commit ourselves anew to your service. To recognise again the privilege of your call in our lives. And to pray that you will touch each of us anew. To lift us up when we feel weary. And to heal us when we are broken. To enliven our hearts, our minds, our actions, and to enable us more faithfully and more closely to follow in the footsteps of Jesus our Lord. We pray this not in any strength of our own, but in and through the strength and power of your Holy Spirit. And grant us all travelling mercies this day. Amen.
Kia ora, Richard.
Cheers, Donna.